Hi, this is Jacob It's Learning. This is Spanish language skills, but what we're going to put here is this is actually on the Spanish advanced placement for the Scholastic Aptitude Test, and this is a real SAT. So before we get into the meaning of this poem, I'm just going to underline some things here that you know, and like some of these words come across the same in other languages. So for those of you who speak Italian, or maybe you have a grandmother, somebody who speaks Italian, there you are, patria. For those of you who may go to Catholic Church, in la nom de la patria, it's there. So this is a basic word, tiempo, and this is not so basic, but cansados is tired. If we took this word, if we took this O off, and most of you who took advanced placement, you really don't need this, but I'm going to go over it anyway. You see that that's camp. So easily you get here that that's a field. Okay, and I want you to try to make a word association with this. A lot of people look at this and think it's a name, but remember, salir is to leave, salir. And so it's kind of coming off like, hey, it's past tense. I left myself at the camp, at the field, and the soul, it had been, that's kind of a conditional drinking. We call arroyos, we call them like low areas, like fields. This is earnings. This isn't hard, guys, right? This is license. And it may not take the literal term. Remember, sombras are shadows. If you were to take these two letters and turn them around easily, very easily, you have enter. So this is kind of what you got. You guys say holler all the time. Holler, kind of the same thing. Vestido is a dress, so this is kind of like my dressings are to serve you, earning. And here's your image. I have an image of my death. Easy. Los ojos, basic word. The same luck. Okay, entered the ages. So you would try to get a feeling of it. And this is actually a psalm from the Bible. And for those of you who are another religion, if you ever see this, you'll see Psalm. This is number 20. Most of you AP guys know that. This is 5, and these two are 2. So it's Psalm 27. And a lot of you are pretty familiar with that. But if they go back and ask you to translate it in Spanish, just remember in the Bible, it doesn't necessarily have the same nor the original translation. Okay, so that's the beginning. And this is all down here. So this is just information. Various poems was in Madrid, Spain. Cathedral editions. Okay. So let's go moving on through what this poem means, and let's get into the concluded it. Now, I'm going over here and I'm looking at words that actually came here, and this here is translated. So if you can get this in your head, if you have notes, you may not have time to do this because they're saying it's a suggested time. So, you have some representation here. The sun drinks. It's not literal, but it makes a reference. So if you want to tie this back in your story, and they do make you write in Spanish, so you want to see what's going on. Ganados means earners. Cattle has literally become a word that means earners, because ganar is to earn, to win. Okay? So cattle actually means earners, and you've got to take this stuff out and try to get the figurative language here. Complaining cattle, and I want to put here that some of this stuff is not literal, and if it's not literal, it's figurative, and most of you knew that. So this just ways to go over it and pick it out. In his shadows, who's he? This is a reference to God or Jesus Christ. A lot of people have these long discussions about the Trinity, that God was God and then he came as Jesus and then he was man walking around. You don't have to get into that. But whenever you say this, sus sombras means in his shadows, gives a license towards the day. So this person kind of feels bad, and I had mentioned in another side that this was like fatherland, it's homeland. And he's talking about, this is my homeland. It was a strong time, it's now crumbling. There was a large age, and when you go back to what we already wrote, where the Indians ran things, okay? You go through parts of Mexico and the Aztecs, a lot of those eras, that's who was there. Okay, so now they're tired from age, and then he uses this word obedience at a time of cold death. And obedience can also be that someone came and broke what was going on in Mexico. I took myself from the field, I see the sun drinks, the brooks of ice untied, and from the mountain there were complaining cattle because the shadow gives license. Okay, somehow tie this in. And if you can't deal with one or two of these words, don't. They just expect you to know how to write and how to tie it and how your mind thinks. Okay? And he makes a reference here again to Jesus Christ. He's saying it's worn. Remember, Jesus Christ was in a white cloth, blood-soaked. So you could even take something here, and here's here, and then he says, I don't see the image of my death. But you wonder if he's thinking about death, and how I don't see the image of my own death, but I see somebody else's. So you can think about how you want to write that and how you're going to go about doing that. On the next slides, we're going to go over how this was concluded. And again, this is just an idea to get you started. So just to start us out, we go over the 25th Psalm, El Salmo vigésimo quinto, a compartía la franqueza de una conquista cuando los indios pidieron su país a la reina Isabella. Y also, you can take out, the frankness of his quandas when the Indians were to be in charge under the reign of Isabella. That's what you think. But if you put this doesn't talk about Baroque. So you've got to go back and redo the period of the Baroque structure. And let me write what this is. This is Baroque. So this is a good point. When you start writing an essay, you can always talk about how Mexico has had this going on dialogue and discussion about, like, the Aztecans were here, Montezuma was killed by Hernan Cortez and all this stuff. But you've also got to go back over what's really going on, okay? And if we go to the second part, we might be able to keep that. We want to make sure that we keep the 25th Psalm, which is here, that the Psalm is a prayer. This is what's going on here, that reflects the insults, the deaths, and the destruction of a sacrament, a tribute to God, the church. Okay, a sacrament, a tribute to God, the church. And you see a couple of the structures here. See a reference to a cross. You see a cross, a little bit of a cross up here. And, it's an edifice. Actually, this is a monasterio. It's a monastery. So it's an old one. And as we speak, those of you who've been in Mexico since 2019 know that this kind of got rebuilt. But this is a picture that I guess someone took in 2011. And Juan Rulfo, who is the writer, Ruinas del Convento de Tecali. Okay, that's the Mexicans. Okay? And he brought it up about the ruins of, this would be the Mexicans, and that's what I thought. But see, up here, they're telling you to write about the time of the Baroque, of the church, and how like wooden structures were very important. The Spanish laid these kind of wooden structures out. If you go to Mexico, they do the same thing. This is kind of a Baroque structure, where they're building a lot of wood, a lot of cathedrals like you see if you come down here in Miami are built under Spanish and Mexican traditions of, like one layer on top of another like you see here, and then another layer, and then you have a window here, and very beautiful structures. So please make sure that you answer the question, and then that way you can take this out. But you can still keep the second part, okay? And este salmo indice que una persona needs help from God, and that the destruction shows the ruins. Okay? Now, who talked in the Psalms in the 25th? That was probably Paul. Okay, you had very many people talk the Psalm. You had the Psalm of David. You had the Psalm. This is about Paul. Paul was talking about how he was caught, how he was being accused, and how he was ultimately going to be killed and sacrificed. So if you can bring this back to the Psalm of Paul, some people say Saul. It doesn't matter. Okay, in my Bible right now it says Paul before that whole name change came around. And you say Paul. Okay, this DES almost always in Spanish and in anything means destroyed or taken away. So I changed it around and I said, I put here las palabras desmoronados signify, or la palabra desmoronados signifies that the things that include the walls, they've been torn down. Also, the soul of the speaker has fallen, and I'm using the word has fallen because your soul doesn't actually fall, but they make reference to falling things and ruined things. And then you say because the speaker experimented the tension that came from the situation. The situation had been a series of problems caused by many assassinations. Now, Baroque structure comes from after the Mexican Revolution, and if anyone knows anything about this gentleman, very distinguished speaker, screenwriter, and writer and lecturer, that Juan Rulfo had his father actually killed during this time. So, of course, he had a lot to say because his father was assassinated. So I put here, to me, I believe that the author is describing about the Mexican Revolution and the history of Mexico in general. In Mexico, there's a lot of wealth, a lot of beauty, but there's also a lot of destruction. This is a grand area. It's a large area open. Mexico and the possession of the land were very important concepts because the conquerors initiated or started, and it started with the death of King Montezuma. And again, I'm writing it the way that it was written in Spanish. You can write it however you want. But also, and also there's a big discussion over who controlled Mexico. And anyone wants to go back and think through the history, which is why as teachers we tell you, think about everything and put it together. There was a whole history of America, then the Spanish Civil War, Veracruz, the Alamo, who took that. That all has to do with this one word. Who runs it? Who is in charge of what you call the hegemony? And who's actually going to be the person or the people who run it? Okay? And if you go back to this time, you're talking about the hegemony of the Indians in Mexico. So you can just bring this up as a short, even though the Baroque period was after that. Okay, but the photo, we can go back, is proof of an area that was desecrated and has ruins. It's proof of the desecration and the ruins. And you have here the desecration was represented through parts of this here, which is a monastery. So you always go back and tie the picture in. So I'm going to highlight this. You want to tie back what you actually see in print, in Spanish print, to what's actually going back to what you actually see the monastery, which has always been a symbol, and this is a ruin of the area. Okay, so the desiccation was a ruin of this symbol, and the monastery is not necessarily a ruin of the area, but a monastery is a ruin of desecration, which comes to what? Comes to God. Okay, now in the Baroque period, the church was a central importance to Spain and to Mexico. In contrast, the author is demonstrating that the church has been destroyed. This is destroyed and it ought to be a sacrament. Meanwhile, the conquerors destroyed the sacrament, and this always makes a reference to God. And there was in the poem espadas, the spades, the chuckers, whatever you want to call them, the weapons. They tore the innocent. And this is a word here that if you ever read Juan Rulfo, I haven't read a lot of him, but he does talk about the innocent. Because he says millions of innocent people got killed because of all these battles, and that happens in almost any battle. Okay, meanwhile, the conquest destroyed the sacrament. The spades, we went over this. I'm just starting this here. This isn't meant for you to do it again. I wanted to start it here so you knew it was a continuation of a paragraph. If you don't know about the epoch, the destroyed church represents an uncertain concept because as a building, a monastery, a church, or a convent, it is able to be destroyed due to the necessity to need something for growth and development. If you know this author, which maybe some of you haven't read, so you're going to have to try to think what Senor Rulfo would be thinking about during this epoch, and hopefully your teachers have gone over the epochs like you do when you're taking a history test, American history, go over Spanish history with you so you can get when this period is. Okay, if you know this, you will comprehend the influence that on the subject and on the Mexican Revolution, because it's really what he talked about. He became interested in this revolution because his father was assassinated during this time. As an eloquent writer, he had much to say about gave about many causes and results. Okay, and the results of things that happened because of some of the things that happened during the Revolution, also about the Spanish Civil War, some of these things that went on. Okay, and so here we go again, talking about support from Spain and from the United States, that there might have been an internal war, but it was supported by somebody. So also his themes included destruction, hate, and again, this keeps coming up, death, homicides of the innocent. So now you can go ahead, you've said something, so you can conclude it. And through the conclusion, we're going to change the words around so that you look like you have more vocabulary, more eloquent. The illustration and the words from the poem describe the tragedy of Mexicans and the conquest from Spain. This should be poor, or through Spain, or you can leave of there. I'm going to go ahead and leave of. Okay? The writer and the poet, they give a reality that affected millions of indigenous people. And before we get too much on the indigenous side, let's talk about who was there. There was just also Mexican people in general, those who were indigenous and those who were not, but they had been in Mexico at least for, like 100 years, and then boom, someone's coming to take your land. Okay? With only the photo, it is difficult to write about the theme. And also, Juan Rulfo, he has become a journalist and an artist that captured the words obedience at the time of the cold death. And so you have to take these words and take them and use them to see. With just the photo, you're not kind of going to get this. That's why I want you to control it. So what does word say? Okay, these words represent the sentiments of cold death during Mexico. And you can go here and explain more about how death is cold, especially if it's to the innocent. And then he gets here and he says, neither the obedience nor the respect it was shown during the revolution, because the buildings, they were destroyed. At the final finale, the author wrote that he had not had the capacity to see his death. But here's a question. What is the reason the author needs to see an image of his death? And then you go back to what Psalm said. In Psalm, the speaker Paul cried in written form about, this is written form, this makes you look more eloquent, like you're taking an adjective here and turning it in. You're taking the word escribir and turning it into an adjective and going forma escrita, that he had written form about his coming death, and the sentiments about the conditions and the accusations against him. The answer is that the speaker, he had been disgusted about the desecration and the deaths. So you want to make sure that you're trying to tie this. And I did this very quickly, and I'll go on ahead and admit this is not my best work, but this was done quickly and to get to a point, because if you don't do this in a certain amount of time, you're going to run out of time, and then you're going to say, oh my goodness, this and that. So you have to do as quickly as you can. And if you have a chance, you can refine this and try to do a little bit more of a better job. But right now, this is just a cursory situation on what happened and on how you can try to make this, take what you have, go from here, and try to make it a little better. This is just a brief on how you try to write what's going on. Okay, thanks for watching.